Good morning. We have a girls show. Welcome to Breaking Points. Krystal, how are you doing this morning?
Doing good. Always a pleasure to be here with you, Emily. I love your vibe. The way you start is so different from Sagar.
Because I don't scream. Is it because it's good for your ears? You feel like it just
feels like a vibe. You just sort of ease into the show. I like it.
I also I'm just now realizing that producer Mac gave us specific mugs for each show. I have the Counterpoints mug, but he gave you the Breaking Points mug.
Yeah, the Indeed We Do one.
It's just perfect. We're just absolutely going full steam ahead this morning. Big show.
Yes.
Great guest coming up in the A block, by the way, to break down this huge news about the Trump trial. The jury is quite literally out right now.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the one Trump trial that actually is likely to happen before Election Day, and the jury is deliberating. So we've got Bradley Moss coming back on the show to tell us what he made of the cases that were made on both sides and what he reads into. The jury did come back and ask for a few things, so we'll get all of that for you as we await a verdict. We also have a bunch of 2024 news on both sides of the aisle. So Trump just shamelessly courting billionaires and promising them whatever they want to give him money for his campaign, sort of pushing the boundaries of campaign finance laws. At the same time, Democrats have just bailed on doing a live actual nomination process. They have announced they're going to do it online. So we'll get into that and why that is. No surprise. They're afraid of protesters, et cetera. Got a bunch of big news coming out of Israel. They're basically announcing forever war. They've also announced they've taken control of that Rafah area border crossing with Egypt. So a lot that's significant there. You also have Hollywood coming out against the war in a way that they haven't yet. So it's kind of interesting to get into. And even Simone Sanders, former White House person, operative, is turning on the White House in certain specific ways. We've got some really fascinating polling about how young people feel about the country. Basically, they believe that they are living in a dying empire run by bad people, and who could really disagree with them at this point? And some breaking news with regards to, it's a lot of legal stuff in the show today. Diddy's legal trouble appears to be escalating. They're preparing for some witnesses to go in front of grand jury. We asked Bradley Moss if he would speak to that as well, and he said, quote, hard pass.
Hard pass. So the one point I know we'll talk about it in the block, but this is a billion-dollar empire, really. I mean, Diddy is a business. It's not just about Diddy. It's about how powerful businesses were involved in this over the course of years. So we'll break all that down.
I mean, it is about this culture of complicity. I mean, how many people knew what was going on? Because we're now up to potentially dozen different victims. It really is far-reaching, and you have to imagine that there were many people who knew and just turned a blind eye. So once again, the powerful protected, at least for some significant period of time. Yeah. Before we jump into the show, thank you guys so much for hanging with us as we switch to locals. I think it has been overall very smooth, but there have been a few bumps as these things go. So if you are still having any issue whatsoever, email support@locals.com and CC breakingpointspremium@gmail.com. Producer Griffin is all over it. He's spending a lot of time trying to make sure everybody has a smooth transition. So again, support@locals.com, breakingpointspremium@gmail.com. Email both of those addresses and we will figure out whatever is going for you, I promise. In addition, for those of you who still want to watch the show on Spotify and YouTube, remember, it is still going to be on all the platforms where it has always been. Easiest place to find those links right now, because we're having this little issue with Spotify legal. It'll get worked out. But in the meantime, look in your email. Premium subscribers, you will have the Spotify link and also the YouTube premium link as well. So those, I think, are all of the things that we need to talk about this morning.
I wanted to give out producer Griffin's phone number, but I was told that was a bridge too far.
I was ready to give out the address so you could go protest outside his house if you want, if you're not happy with the experience, but we'll keep it at the email for now. All right, let's go ahead and turn to the Trump trial and what is going on there. So we are very fortunate to be joined by legal expert Bradley Moss. He is here to break down what we know of the Trump hush money trial. Great to see you as always, Bradley.
Absolutely. Always happy to join.
So let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. We got a tear sheet here talking about what could happen if Trump is, in fact, convicted, found guilty here. He would go and be reviewed by New York City's Department of Probation. He, of course, could appeal. So unlikely that he would be sent to prison in the near term. But Bradley, I really wanted to get your assessment to start with here of the case that the prosecution made, how strong you thought it was, and how good of a job you felt the defense did in poking holes and creating that reasonable doubt in the prosecution's case here.
Sure. So the prosecution, I think, did more or less the best they could with what is ultimately a circumstantial case. They built sort of a wall, a foundation of various pieces of evidence and testimony to surround the only key eyewitness who can talk about the connection of Donald Trump to these falsification of the records and the underlying intent. And that person, of course, is Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen has his own issues when it comes to credibility and ethics. We saw some of that in the civil trial with Alina Habba cross-examining him. And we certainly saw it during the criminal trial when he was cross-examined over the course of about a day and a half. He's not the greatest witness on the planet, which is why the entirety of the prosecution's case came first to surround him, to reinforce him, so that if for any reason there were concerns in the jury regarding some of the credibility of his testimony, they had corroboration that could reassure them. That was the prosecution's burden. That was their job to do. I think they did a pretty decent job at it, certainly enough to likely convict. When it came to the defense's case, and I have to assume some of this was client-driven as opposed to what the lawyers truly wanted. Remember, one of the lawyers left before the trial even began, most likely because of the client's preferred strategy. But it was all based on the idea that this was all a lie. Not that, yes, it happened, but here's why it's not a crime, or yes, it happened, but here's why it was all about personal embarrassment. It was the affair never happened. This was all just extortion, and Trump knew nothing about anything. That was their approach. I don't think that was necessarily the strongest approach to take. I thought there was a lot of holes they could have punched in the government's case in terms of the idea of whether or not Trump truly had any knowledge here, especially could have brought in some more witnesses. But that was the approach they took. I don't think they expect an acquittal. They might be looking for a hung jury, though.
Oh, interesting. And yeah, I saw you actually tweeting about this yesterday. There was all kinds of controversy about the jury notes that were requested, about the jury instructions. The jury is continuously deliberating today. What did you make of it was sort of like skirmishes on Twitter over what was true and what was false about what was happening with the jury yesterday. But what did you make of everything that transpired after the jury was sent out for deliberations and we kept getting some indications about what they might be thinking?
Yeah, so far, we're just trying to read tea leaves here. We're trying to get into the minds of jurors, and none of us truly know what's happening in that room. But from what we saw from the notes, the information they were requesting, it was largely focused on the testimony of David Pecker from the National Enquirer and his conversations both with Trump and with Cohen dating back to 2015. That speaks more to that intent element, that secondary part that bumps it up to a felony. That speaks to the idea of whether or not this was done with the intent to commit another crime, potentially a campaign finance issue. That doesn't speak to the falsification. So if you are trying to infer where the jury's looking at this right now, they might buy that there was falsification of the business records, at least the misdemeanor. What they're not certain yet on is whether or not there was enough evidence to bump it up to the felony if they can reach a decision that there was a unanimous decision that there was an intent to commit another crime, and then they can decide which of those other crimes they're allowed to select from they believe was the intended crime to commit. That's where we're looking right now. We still got to see. We got a whole day today of deliberations. We'll see if they have a verdict today or if it goes into tomorrow.
Yeah, what is your sense? I mean, obviously none of us can really know, but do you have a guess of how long it may take for them to deliberate, especially given the fact that already yesterday we were getting these notes and requests and they were clearly dealing with some of the core substance of the case?
So it'd be interesting to see, one, well, as the jury comes back in this morning and they have some this read back and this extra information they were requesting from the judge, it'd be interesting to see how long that takes to go through. But if you're Donald Trump right now, you want lengthy deliberations. The longer this takes, the more this gets into Friday, the more this gets into Monday of next week, the more likely it is that there is one or two holdouts that are preventing a verdict, or more or less likely a guilty verdict, and that's good for Donald Trump. We hear about a verdict today. My expectation is that's a guilty verdict.
Interesting. And I want to ask about this analysis that conservative attorney, although fairly anti-Trump attorney, Andy McCarthy wrote in National Review. He said, listening to the presentation of evidence in the prosecutor's marathon summation, the jurors were undoubtedly convinced that prosecutors do not have to prove the FICA violation to find Trump guilty. Rather, the judge and prosecutors have led jurors to believe that the violation of FICA is an established fact in the case, almost as if Merchan has taken judicial notice of it. It's as if the jury need not concern itself with FICA. Bragg prosecutors, aided and abetted by Merchan, pulled this off by telling the jury again and again and again that Cohen pled guilty to 2 FICA felonies and that David Pecker, entered a non-prosecution agreement with the Justice Department because he feared prosecution. Not to beat a dead horse yet again, McCarthy continues, but this evidence is utterly inadmissible against Trump, yet Merchan has allowed prosecutors to tell the jury about the pleas and non-prosecution agreement dozens of times. So if Donald Trump is convicted, that argument is going to be amplified, obviously, on the right and by a lot of Trump voters. What do you make of it? I mean, I know that's sort of a can of worms, but this question of how Merchan, who, Republicans have pointed out, his daughter is a fairly high-profile Democratic consultant, and there are all kinds of issues that people have raised with him. Is there there to what Andy McCarthy is saying, in the sense that this could really inflame a lot of Trump supporters if a conviction comes down? I mean, it will either way, but will there be sort of substance to those complaints?
Yeah, so let's be honest here. They're going to be inflamed no matter what if there's a conviction. It didn't matter how clean or perfect the case was put on. What Andy has gotten into here is an issue of legal nuance that is part of the realities of a lot of the pretrial fights that were done between the parties before Judge Merchan, and how it was outlined that the case would proceed. When it comes to trial litigation, I kind of view it as the way people always say, don't watch how the sausage is made because he'll gross you out. You'll never want to consider eating it. Don't watch how trial litigation happens and the nitty-gritty details if you ever want to have faith in the criminal justice system, because it's not pretty. But what has to be done here for the prosecution to get a guilty verdict, and this needs to be very clear because there was a lot of confusion yesterday with the jury instructions. There needs to be a unanimous verdict by the jury that Trump falsified or caused the falsification of the business records. There needs to be a unanimous verdict that he did it with the intent to commit another crime. Those parts have to be unanimous. Where there is room for some discretion with the jury is what the other crime was. They don't have to decide as a unanimous group. They can, but they don't have to decide as a unanimous group that it was the FICA violation, that it was state tax law or state campaign finance issue. That is a sort of a unique but viable feature of this New York law that's in place. The law has been on the books since the 80s. It's been upheld in the appellate courts in New York multiple times. The Supreme Court's never ruled on it, obviously. That may be an issue for appeal. That would be fascinating. But Donald Trump here is ultimately a victim of the very kind of laws he always trumpeted in New York as, combating crime. He just doesn't like it because it's being used against him.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you basically think an acquittal is likely off the table because of the defense that the Trump team chose to present. Is that correct?
Which is what McCarthy thinks too, by the way.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, anything's possible. Juries are completely unpredictable. We never truly know. That's the beauty of the jury system. But I don't think anybody realistically believes at this point that you're going to see a unanimous verdict of acquittal. It's all about, can they get a unanimous verdict for guilty, or will there be one or two people who just can't put enough faith in Michael Cohen because of his credibility issues that they just can't get there on the idea that Trump was actually involved in the discussions or had reason to believe this was going to be transpiring in terms of the falsification, and they just won't go along with it. It's entirely possible. That's why we put our faith in these 12 jurors. They're ordinary citizens. That's their obligation and duty today. And
so can you walk us through, since you think an acquittal is more or less off the table, barring some, you never know, kind of a circumstance, can you walk us through, okay, if he's found guilty, here's what happens next and what that process looks like. And if there's a hung jury and a mistrial declared, what does that process look like?
Sure. So if there's a hung jury, there's two issues. One, there's the political ramifications, which is he'll declare victory. Anything short of conviction, Donald Trump will declare victory, say, look, they couldn't even get a jury of 12 Trump-hating, evil, liberal communists to convict me. Clearly, these charges are garbage. If he is convicted, to be very clear, he is not going to get hauled off and sent off to Rikers that day. It's not happening. There will be a hearing set for a sentencing. There will be a pre-sentencing report. There will be any number of documentations and briefs submitted by both parties to the judge based off of New York state law in terms of what the sentence, if any, should be. Almost certainly the prosecution is going to request some jail time. He's not going to get the maximum. He's not going to get, I think it's 4 years is what he could get under the law. He's not getting that. If he gets something, it'll be 3 to 6 months at most. That is where the issue of this past criminal contempt, what we saw with the gag order violations, that's where that may come into play, is whether or not Judge Merchan considers that as an aggravating factor, saying, I was considering probation, but forget it now. I'm putting you on 3 to 6 months imprisonment. Now we've got a whole logistical problem of where do you put a former president?
Well,
Right.
and that was just going to be my last question is, based on what we've seen from Judge Merchan, what can we expect about how he'll handle that question?
I think from what we've seen in his past analyses, it's going to be a very thorough discussion. I understand it's the thing right now amongst conservative pundits to trash him left and right because of what his daughter does or because of how he's ruled on some of these pretrial issues, and that's fine. It's First Amendment. People can say what they want. I think he's been a pretty decent jurist. He's cut back a lot on what I thought the prosecution wanted to do in their presentation that ultimately ended up favoring Trump a little bit and narrowed the scope of the government's presentation. I don't expect anything draconian, even with the aggravating factor. Again, I don't see anything more than a few months if he sentences them to prison time at all. There's no chance that it happens in the sense of Trump being sent to prison before the election.
And if he is convicted, if he is found guilty, I presume he can avail himself of an appeals process. What does that look like? How does that play out?
Yeah, he can almost certainly and also, of course, will immediately file an appeal. That will wind its way through the New York appellate courts. That doesn't necessarily put a hold on his sentence. His lawyers certainly could ask for a stay of the sentence pending resolution of the appeals. That would be up to New York appellate courts. But a lot of this becomes ultimately irrelevant post-November, because if Trump wins, there's no chance he's going to jail anyways at that point as a sitting president. If he loses, he's got those other 3 criminal cases that are still on tap to come to trial one day eventually, maybe in 2029. He'll almost certainly start cutting deals to minimize jail time so he doesn't spend the rest of his life in jail at that point.
All right, last question, which I know you're not going to want to answer, but what do you think are the odds of conviction versus hung jury?
People keep asking me this. If I'm sitting at the table in Vegas and I absolutely have to place a bet, right now I'm leaning towards conviction. Everything indicates the jury's questions are leaning along those lines. But you know what? Juries are unpredictable, and we won't know until we know.
Bradley, so grateful for you taking the time with us this morning. Thank you so much for your analysis.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
So great to hear Bradley Moss's assessment there. I mean, honestly, watching it, Emily, I've had no clue which way things are going to go, and I'm not the legal expert. So good to hear his analysis there. And even, just to he's resistance pro-Joe Biden guy, but we've found his analysis to be pretty even-handed when it comes down to it. The other thing we wanted to get into is, the big question is, does this matter politically?
Right.
CNN's Harry Enton actually did a whole analysis that found, in terms of the trial, there has been basically no movement in the polls from the beginning of the trial to now, like literally none. So it hasn't mattered from that perspective. The number of people who think he's guilty or not guilty, according to CNN, their polling has found that hasn't really shifted either. But I will say, put a 5 up on the screen. You do have a majority of Americans, 56%, who say he's definitely or probably guilty of a crime in the case. And this is, of course, falsifying business records to hide a quote-unquote hush money payments. You've got 37% who say he's definitely guilty, 19% who say he's probably guilty, 21% who say probably not guilty, and 23% who say definitely not guilty. It was interesting to hear from Bradley that the defense didn't really present a definitely not guilty case. They presented, the converse. They did present he did nothing wrong. It was a perfect phone call, kind of a defense, which he felt that the jurors, and I think most people would find kind of unbelievable, the idea he did nothing wrong. There were probably stronger avenues for them to pursue in terms of just casting doubt on whether it was solely for campaign reasons and casting down on Michael Cohen, et cetera.
Yeah, And it's funny that CBS questioned, because NPR tested this as well, but like the question of is Trump specifically guilty of a crime? If I were taking that poll and not listening closely, I might be like, oh, he's probably guilty. Because in my mind, I'm thinking probably guilty, yes, of paying the hush money to Stormy Daniels
the affair
and having an affair
yeah.
with Stormy Daniels while Melania Trump was pregnant. Do I think he's definitely or probably guilty of that? Yes. Of the crime? That's such an interesting question because even whether what he did is a crime is part of what's being contested. And Andy McCarthy, I was glad to get Bradley to respond to that because what Andy McCarthy is saying is that Merchan has allowed Bragg to get away with trumping this up to a felony charge as an election thing because it's only a felony to commit this crime of falsifying records if it's in the service of a federal violation, so election law in this case. And the Trump prosecution just wanted to do the Trump campaign strategy without conceding an inch. And that's at least McCarthy, and it sounds like Bradley, think was their sort of fatal mistake here. But they, in the defense of the Trump prosecution, they would probably say he's probably going to be convicted anyway. Either way, I mean, this Manhattan jury is probably going to convict Donald Trump.
Hard to say. I still have no idea what's going to ultimately happen here. On the political front, I think that most normie type voters aren't really getting into the nitty gritty of like some of the legal arguments you're raising and like the specifics of how this was this novel legal interpretation required this other crime to make this one a felony, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally.
Most of it is viewed through the typical lens of how do you feel about Donald Trump? Like, do you think he's a criminal or not? And most of that is going to come down to partisan affiliation. Now, I do think that there is on the margin some, people feel, and I think rightly feel, that, the documents case, it's kind of open and shut. It's kind of hard to deny that there were, some real problems with the way he handled that whole situation, obstructing justice and whatever. Even if the original keeping of the documents was an innocent mistake, the fact that you went to these great lengths to cover it up, I think most people look at that and okay, yeah, there's something wrong there. And also they know the way that other people who have mishandled classified documents have been treated. But in general, when you look at the polling, there actually isn't all that much difference between how people view these different cases. It's mostly just filtered through the lens of, do you think Donald Trump is a criminal? Do you not think he's a criminal? And that's why there hasn't been a lot of polling shift over the course of this trial, this case. First of all, there's a lot of other things going in the world. I don't think people have dug into this that much. I just don't think that they're paying that much attention. Yeah. They already know how they feel about Donald Trump. So the only question that remains is okay, if he's actually convicted of a felony, does that hit in a different way than just thinking that he's guilty of a felony? And I don't really think so. I don't really think this is going to move the needle really one way or another, probably, but I can't say with 100% certainty.
Yeah, I think that's the right take. I mean, when a former president is actually sentenced, I mean, this is not something that we've seen. Nixon was pardoned, and people were upset about it at the time, although people look back on it now as a noble decision by Gerald Ford. We haven't seen a former president get sentenced to 4 years, potentially, as Bradley was just talking to us about. And I don't think we know how we're going to react to that yet. Yeah. I agree with you that if I had to put money down, I would say probably this doesn't move the needle a lot. If anything, the NPR poll I mentioned earlier found 15% of Republicans said that this makes them more likely to support Donald Trump. And to the extent that the Bragg case has mattered at all in the election, people forget that the Ron DeSantis bump that he had going into the primary disappeared when Alvin Bragg, that's when his numbers started going down, is when Bragg brought this case, or the news that Bragg was going to bring this case. As that happened, Trump's numbers went up, DeSantis' numbers went down. So I think it did really have an effect in that sense. But I agree, I think it's probably, people are hard into their positions in the general election at this point. It's not, if anything, it makes Donald Trump getting sentenced to 4 years in prison. I think it could hurt undecided, independent support for him, but I think it could help his turnout, and that's going to be pretty critical.
I think it's very unlikely he's sentenced to a significant prison term. But even if it's 3 months,
yeah, it's prison.
You know, you're thinking about when we did the Republican focus group, and you know, you had a room full of people who were real Republicans, not rhinos, and even some of the people who were Trump first in the Republican primary context. When it was like, okay, but what if he's facing prison time? They're like, that's too much.
Yeah.
But I think you made the most important point, which is like, I think people are very bad at anticipating how they're going to react to certain things until they happen. And so I've been really skeptical of all these polls that have said like, oh, well, if he's convicted and if he's facing prison time, then, you know, 50% of voters say that they're out and they're not going to vote for him. I don't think people know before they see it for themselves. So again, I don't put out of the realm of possibility that it could have some sort of significant electoral impact. But if Democrats are betting the farm on this one, I think they better find a different farm or whatever.
Which is why they ended up bringing all of the other cases, and now all of the other cases are just not going to. I mean, probably one of the most important things to say here is that a lot of these other cases are not going to be tried before the election, and that was Democrats really intentionally, basically, were throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick legally, and it's not hard to find, you know, questionable legal decisions by Donald Trump, who, as we're going to talk about, we even have video from 2016 and 2015 in the next block of Donald Trump being like, I know the system. I alone can fix it because I am part of the corrupt system of American business and politics. You know, it's not that hard to see what sticks, and that was their strategy. And this is the only one they're probably going to have before November.
Yep. All right. So we'll see how it all plays out. Well, let's go ahead and get to that news about 2024.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.